So I just wanted to share with you, prior to outlining some of the research that I'm currently working on so that we can debate and discuss it, the larger framework of analysis, because it overlaps to a certain extent with some of the things that I presented on the first day of the workshop. And my current book project, entitled The Intellectual World War, looks at what I'm referring to as the great Western ideological realignment. And that is how it is that from approximately World War II to the present, the Western intelligentsia has been transformed in its center of gravity, meaning that in the post-war era, it was largely recognized that Marxism was a materialist science that had given an adequate account of world history, but that was also an evolving and dynamic science rather than being one that was dogmatic or had its heels dug in. And so the majority of the Western intelligentsia was Marxist, Marxian of various sorts. And we compare that to the situation in the 1980s and 1990s. We saw this with Larry Busk's research on radical democracy, for instance, and we've come across this theme before. You see an unbelievable realignment where what is called critique, critical theory, critical thinking, etc., is unmoored from Marxist historical materialism and then begins to float adrift on the seas of discursivity. And radicality and critique and other such things are redefined as primarily discursive practices. And there is a very rampant left anti-communism and a rabid critique of actually existing socialism that is largely uninformed, meaning it's not actually engaging with actually existing socialism. It's based on reading Western media reports on actually existing socialism. And that is not then paralleled by an equal critique of Western imperialism, right? You see this in the case of Foucault would be a great example, right? He wrote extensively on how awful China and the Soviet Union and Cuba and other places were, but then oddly didn't seem to engage with the history of American imperialism at a point in time at which, of course, he was being invited to the United States, occupied the premier institutional positions in France and other such things. And so I'll get into a little bit of that detail, but that's the larger framing. And one of the things that I'm interested in is that a lot of the way people think about and engage with intellectual history is from an idealist approach, meaning that the primary assumption is that it's ideas and cultures that drive history, not material forces. Right. And so often you'll have the history of French theory told in terms of, well, they're existentialists, they thought this, they were criticized by the structuralists who thought this, the post-structuralists who thought this, etc. That creates the illusion that it's ideas that are driving history. And there's not an exploration of the actual material forces that are driving these particular traditions, producing their intellectual work, distributing it globally, having it translated into other such things. So one of the other major focal points for this research project is the global theory industry, how it operates, what forces are at work behind it, and in what ways does it subject international intellectual production to a form of triage that allows for the consolidation of particular understandings of critique and the sidelining, discrediting of other such forms. Moreover, this global theory industry has contributed to a kind of canonization of critique, right? So that everywhere, anywhere in the world, if you want to be an intellectual engaged in contemporary debates, you are more or less required to know something about Foucault, Derridas, Spivak, Dussel, or other such figures. You might ignore some, but then you need to know others. But you can, and in fact, you are encouraged to ignore enormous communal traditions of revolutionary critique that have been ongoing for the last 200, 300, 500 years, right? And so this canonization of a particular form of critique basically subjects intellectuals around the world to a particular time economy. And that is that, well, if you want to know something about revolutionary indigenous thought and practice, first you have to read Foucault and Derrida and these other figures. So it regulates the time economy of intellectuals. And moreover, much of it is based on burying the revolutionary critique beneath historical Tommy rot and nonsense narratives, straw person versions of what Marxism is or has represented historically and other such things. And this becomes the kind of lingua franca of cultured critique, right? Almost everyone in the 1980s and 1990s, if they sounded vaguely Marxian or brought up things like class, race, and radical gender and sexuality politics, had to add to that, of course, I condemn everything that Mao represents, everything that Stalin and Lenin and Che and Fidel and everybody else represents, right? This was almost just a necessary badge of liberal decorum that was required for so-called critical theorists. And of course, there's a geography to all of this, because the US university, as the kind of international arbiter for, in the way in which its university has evolved in a kind of imperial university, then gets to decide what forms of theory are promoted, what ones are visible, and other such things. The last thing that I would say to this, say just regarding this, and then I want to just outline, this is a rough draft that I have, but I want to just talk you through the argument so that it can be much more dialogical and somewhat informal, is that the stakes for me of doing this type of work, of really excavating the material forces driving the global theory industry in order to ideologically realign the Western intelligentsia from a radical critique of capitalism to positions that are consensual academic internal critiques and ethical orientations and other such things, is that ultimately the consequences of that ideological realignment are the ones that people like me, and I imagine people like you, have suffered the most from. And that is that the modalities of intellectual production, as well as distribution and reception, have been hollowed out and replaced by a certain form of critical theory that completely not only marginalizes, but forecloses the engagement with particular types of discourse. And that we are unfortunately reaping the so-called benefits from this now. And that it's by no means, this is kind of in the backdrop of some of the things that I'll say, it's by no means surprising that the neoliberal assault on the world, which has been going on for 40 or 50 years, happened to coincide with the enormous growth in the theory industry, and particularly one of its niche categories within the US and the larger imperial university, and that is French theory. And so I'm focusing in particular on French theory due to its quintessentially important role. It's also, if I put all of my cards on the table, what I'm trying to do is move from my own subjective experience. I studied in France with a lot of the leaders of French theory, and was always surprised how their political discourse didn't really seem to align with material practice in various ways. And so it's been a long time coming, and sorting through a lot of my own subjective zigzags to recognize that my subjective experience needs to be understood in terms of a larger objective framework of analysis, because it's those forces that were dictating the things I read, was interested in, or even the reason I went to Paris in the first place, right? As opposed to Mexico City or Cuba or South Africa or a million other possible places. So with no further ado, I just want to talk you through the basic argument. The beginning point for this argument is something that I imagine you've all been exposed to, and that is the rampant assumption that there is a close affiliation between May 68, the political and social uprisings in France and globally for that matter, and French theory. Right? This is one of the ways in which French theory has been marketed within the United States. It's also one of the ways it's been criticized within France. And so there's different political coordinates depending on where you're looking. But the basic correlation is that French theory rose to prominence in the mid to late 1960s, right? It arrived in the United States really in 1966 through an enormous grant from the Ford Foundation, which has very well-known ties to the national security state, which brought in the structuralists and left the Marxists in France. This is often pointed to as the kind of birth date of French theory within the US setting. And that only 2 years later, you had this enormous uprising of 68, right? On the heels of the major publication successes of The Order of Things by Foucault in 1966, Écrit by Lacan, which was also in 1966. And so there's this association, which is largely a chronological association between French theory as a global phenomenon and the 68 uprising. But when you begin to look into it and you look at the research that's been done on it, you realize, hopefully, and hopefully quickly, that this association is a free association, right? That there's not actually any parallel that could be materially established between these thinkers and the uprising of the 60s. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail instead of just leaving it there as a blanket statement. But one of the ways in which this originally emerged, this logic, it's a false analogy, right? That French theory intellectually is analogous to the revolutionary upsurge in 68, right? Material practice and intellectual practice are rendered analogical. Or there's supposed to be an analogy between them. One of the major publications in this regard that really set the agenda within the French context was when Luc Ferry and Alain Radnot published their brazen book entitled La Ponce de Santuite, 68 Thought. It was translated into English as French Philosophy of the 60s. And the primary objective of this was a revisionist, liberal, counter-revolutionary assault on the anti-humanism of 68 thought. So what Ferry and Renaud were basically trying to do through this very slapdash historical assemblage that's based much more on free association, correlation, the use of modal verbs and other such things than anything that could be materially proven, is to demonstrate that somehow 68 came out of these kind of libertarian, anarchist tendencies within French thought, and so they should be both condemned, right? And they pointed out, in particular, they went after Bourdieu, Derrida, Lacan, and Foucault were their main focal points. This was a negative critique, but what's interesting within the Anglophone context is that a lot of this was picked up in its positive iteration, right? Meaning that the correlation between the so-called 68 thinkers and the events of 68 was not, in the Anglophone context, largely considered something to be negative, but on the contrary, something positive, right? That these were radical thinkers who were contributing to change, who were somehow in the forefronts of struggles and other such things. And so if you look at the actual material history, and I'm going to jump through this really quickly, but I've spent probably way too much time in figuring out the details, and I'd be happy to revisit them if anyone has any questions. Foucault stands out in this regard, right? Foucault is held up as the 68 thinker. There's lots of photographs with him with megaphones and at protests and other such things. There's actually few occasions where that happened, but there were a lot of photographers there, so it was helped. Foucault was, prior to 68, known for his, quote, violent anti-communism. He was largely identified in his social circles as a Gaullist. De Gaulle was a military leader, of course, who, according to many Marxists, took over France in 1958 in a form of coup d'etat, of course. And he was actually involved in the Gaullist reforms, the educational reforms, that were one of the primary sparks for the student uprising. He himself wrote some of the preparatory reports for these reforms. He served on the commissions, and there's no sign whatsoever that he was opposed to these reforms, which were perfectly in line with the kind of capitalist agenda of the Gaullist regime. And so if Foucault was on any side of the barricades in 68, he was on the side fortified by the French state and the Gaullist French state, of which he was an employee and a diligent and invested employee. In the case of someone like Pierre Bourdieu, who also in the 1980s would earn a reputation as being a kind of leftist in the tradition of Sartre, Bourdieu is on record as having remained in French cafes correcting exams with Jean-Claude Passeron, ignoring the uprisings, paying very scarce attention to what was going on in the street. He would later claim that he was not seduced by the dominant versions of Marxism at the time, and he was opposed to leftist tendencies, as well as the attempt to abolish the separation between science and politics. Bourdieu, if you don't know this, was his entire academic career was dependent upon and leveraged up by the work of Raymond Aron. Aron was the anti-68er, A-R-O-N, par excellence. He was known as being a very close friend of Kissinger and having an endless supply of money to support anti-Marxist social scientific research at the institutions and in the venues supported by American interests. Bourdieu was his assistant. He ran his research center at the OHSS at that point in time. And Aron, very importantly, was also the intellectual spokesperson for the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was revealed in the mid-60s to be a CIA front organization whose goal was to move the Western intelligentsia away from communism and at a minimum to get them to abide by the non-communist left, but ideally to drift further to the right, like Aron, who is an apologist for imperial capitalist politics in general. Bourdieu never spoke out in any public way that I'm aware of regarding Aron's direct dependence on, affiliation with, and work for the Central Intelligence Agency. On the contrary, he in fact avoided the topic by bringing up the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and I guess happening not to mention that it was a CIA front. And he later, of course, regularly criticized 68 thinkers as being leftist posturers who did not abide by the logic of rigorous social scientific analysis, which was, of course, rabidly anti-Marxist. So he was, on his own account, and that of many others, Christine Delphi, the materialist feminist who was originally going to be invited to the workshop this year but couldn't make it due to health problems of her own, was known for being part of Bourdieu's circles and played a very important part in the feminist movements that developed out of 68, was in the streets, encouraged Bourdieu to join her in the streets, but then Bourdieu basically said, well, why don't you photocopy some of my texts and hand it out to the little activists and whatnot. And so his attitude was quite patronizing, belittling, and distant. Derrida is much the same in that regard. One of his good friends, Maurice Blanchot, actually underwent a kind of leftist turn and got very involved in the uprisings of 68. Derrida marched with the students on May 13th. He did organize a general assembly at the École Normale Supérieure, but other than that, he said in a number of interviews that he was not himself a 68er, his heart was not on the barricades. He was bothered by what he referred to as a call for transparency, for communication without relay or delay, the liberation of every sort of apparatus, party or union. That's a quote from Derrida. And he admonished in very interesting language what he referred to as spontaneism, and more specifically, workerism or pauperism. And the only way I can understand these expressions is the idea that you would organize politically around workers, working causes, the question of poverty, and other such things. In that regard, he haughtily disdained the movement, criticized them for being unrealistic and potentially leading to the most dangerous of consequences. Lacan of this group did show certain signs of interest in the student movement early on and actually financially supported it in discrete ways. He met with some of the leaders, including Daniel Cohn-Bendit. He co-signed an important letter that was published on May 10th, but then quite famously kind of positioned himself in relationship to the student and worker movement as being the admonishing father figure of sorts. He called himself a liberal and an anti-progressive in some famous statements that he made in 1969 against some of the student movement. He mocked the students. He claimed that they were playing the role of helots for the Pompidou regime. And he exclaimed, quote, always the revolutionary aspiration has only a single possible outcome, right? This is someone who, right, I love these types of statements where Marxists are considered reductivists, but then other people could say, always there's only one possible outcome to revolution, it is X. And what is the end of all revolutions, according to Lacan? Quote, of ending up as the master's discourse, right? So the fundamental aspiration of revolutionary politics is to aspire to a master, right? He says it in French, it's l'aspiration révolutionnaire, ça n'a qu'une chose d'aboutir, toujours au discours du maître, right? So he really plays this law of the father, the law that is going to at once be what the students who are acting out aspire to and what will then be brought to bear upon them. Because then he famously added, what you aspire to is a master and you will have one, right? So Lacan's position was quite transparent. Cornelius Castoriadis, whose work with socialism and barbarism is widely recognized as an important precursor to the 68 student and worker movement, provided a lapidary corrective to Renaud and Ferry's very slipshod analysis. And it's interesting, his formulation, because he described their analysis as totally nonsensical, because for them, 68 thought is anti-68 thought, right? The people they identify, Lacan, Foucault, Derrida, and Bourdieu, were against 68. They were anti-68 thinkers. And that 68 thought is not only anti-68 thought, the thought that was built on the mass success of the ruins of the 68 movement, and that what they actually had in mind was 86 thought, the kind of reactionary anti-Marxist thought that came to high prominence in the period in which they were writing and came to prominence themselves. Now, I'll go very quickly through this, but we could add a lot of people to this list, right? Claude Lévi-Strauss was in the Latin Quarter at that point in time. He found May 68 repugnant and decried it as yet another step in the degradation of the university. Roland Barthes withdrew, reacted to the events in a way of where he expressed relative indifference, according to his biographer. Hélène Cixous was at the University of Paris-Nanterre, where the student movement kicked off, and she was bewildered on the sidelines, watched the events, and was astonished that there was a desire for a total uprising. Levinas, according to his biographer, quote, respected authority, order, and hierarchies, and he did not appreciate that young people wanted to dictate their law to their elders, end quote. Deleuze was very far from being a revolutionary militant, like his co-author Guattari would be in certain regards. He remained receptive to the student movement, got a little bit and tepidly involved, but then went on to defend his dissertation, actually in one of the first dissertations defended at the Sorbonne, which had been occupied by the students. The case of Louis Althusser and the Althusserians is complex. I'll just highlight in passing, of course, Althusser was a member of the French Communist Party, and he took the line of the Communist Party. The French Communist Party was renowned for aligning itself on a very Stalinist position and identifying the early moments of the uprising as being a non-revolutionary situation because it was driven by petty bourgeois students and student interests. He was also sick and since April of '68, and so he's kind of out of the equation to a large extent, but it led to a big break within the Althusserians, meaning people like Rancière, Badiou, Balibar, and others who were studying under Althusser. And I could go into the details of their various reactions, but it led to important splits and certain radicalizations, definitely in the case of Rancière and Badiou, a shift to the left in their respective politics. One of the things that's interesting, though, is that the student movement, according to many historical accounts, was widely supported by many faculty, right? So the position that the French theorists took wasn't simply a position of professors against students. It was instead the highly prominent French theorists who were profiting from the global theory industry against the more precarious labor pool in the faculty in France at that time and the students, as well as more radical faculty members, some of whom I'll mention in a second. In order to understand then, I think the larger situation that we're faced with in this regard, I think that the best way of framing this relationship between an idealist analogy between theory and practice, which doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and then the historical trajectory by which anti-68 thinkers become 68 thinkers, is in terms of the idea of historical commodity fetishism. Commodity fetishism we're all probably familiar with from the writings of Marx and others, right? The idea that the relations between things would obscure and hide the social relations that have produced those things, right? So you see the commodity of the iPhone or the MacBook or whatever, and you don't see the global nature of social relations, exploitation, third world labor pools, other such things, mining industries that have produced that, right? So what commodity fetishism does is it invisibilizes material history. Right? And it's an aesthetic operation, and the metaphors that Marx will use are largely aesthetic in this regard. And so I think that one of the best ways of understanding this phenomenon that I'm pointing to is in terms of historical commodity fetishism. So the actual social relations operative in political struggle disappear behind the enchantment or the enchanted disgust with an intellectual commodity, right? The commodity of French theory. In that regard, the intellectuals who had indeed participated in the preparation of the movement and committed themselves directly to it have largely been banished or excised from the global phenomenon of French theory, right? So the most well-known case in this regard is the great enemy of the structuralists and post-structuralists, Jean-Paul Sartre. And the reason for this, of course, is that Sartre was, at least for a certain point in his career, basically from the mid-1940s approximately to almost the end of his life, he was an outspoken Marxist. Sartre very quickly had one of the leaders, Alain Guismard, over to his apartment with Beauvoir. He went to the occupation, he spoke out in support, he did interviews, public letters. He really threw all of his public image and support behind the movement. But for those of you who don't, like, it depends on what your apprehension of French theory is, but the prominence of French theory within the United States, and one of the reasons what's called structuralism and post-structuralism, that's largely within the French context simply structuralism, because they're the same project, they're just a radicalization of the same project in certain ways, that this was quintessentially pitted, not just against existentialism as some angst-ridden individual project of, you know, people in the Latin Quarter, but against the Marxism that was represented by Sartre, Beauvoir, Tao, and other people who were sold and presented in the United States as existentialists in order to sweep their Marxism under the rug, so to speak. And so it's important to bring back to the foreground the class struggle that's operative here, right? French theory, as it is globalized through its American stepstone, is an assault on the global Marxist tradition. And that has been its historical social function. Unfortunately for people like me who thought that it bore, at least at some point in time, some type of deeper radical project. I'll give you just a few examples of this. So other than Sartre, the other intellectuals who are largely supportive of 68 and were militantly involved in 68 are those who have either remained within the shadow of French theory or completely disappeared. So probably most of you won't know these names unless you're familiar vaguely with some of the things that were going on or that haven't been translated coming out from France. Alain Guismard is a good example of it. He was one of the leaders of the movement, called for a general strike in higher education on May 3rd. He was a lecturer himself, so he was teaching at the time, and he was the general secretary for the National Teachers Education Union. Alain Krivine was very important for his involvement in the Trotskyist movement, and in particular the Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire, which he had co-founded with Henri Weber, who also taught philosophy in the same department where Foucault taught briefly, Badiou, Rancière, Deleuze, Lyotard, and other. No, Lyotard wasn't there. But it was the central, like, post-68 experimental university. And so the fact that people like this would also be left out of the equation is very, very telling, because they're just beneath the radar. Daniel Ben Saïd is another great example of this. Guy Ockenghem, Daniel Guérin. I already mentioned Christine Delphi. We could add more people to the list. Socialism and Barbarism, I mentioned in passing, the work of Castoriadis, as well as the work of the heterodox Marxist group called Argument, which brought together people like Georges Lapassade, Jean Duvigneau. The Situationist International is, of course, much more well known in the Anglophone world and has been identified as one of the important contributors to the uprisings that led up to and then also part of 68. Henri Lefebvre was a very outspoken Marxist, but of a rather non-orthodox sort, and played an essential role and was teaching at Nanterre, where the student movement kicked off, right? So when you actually see what's going on the ground, it would be easy then to identify a very stark contrast between the supposed 68 thinkers that I just mentioned, who were absent from or skeptical of the movement, and the actual 68 intellectuals who were supportive and directly involved. Whereas the former made illustrious global careers as radical theorists, basking in the glorious aura of 68, the latter have largely remained in the shadows as secondary or unknown figures whose work has often been judged unworthy of extensive translation or commentary. Moreover, it should be clear that the fault lines largely follow the opposition between the trend-setting structuralist and post-structuralist movement on the one hand, and the revolutionary theory of those intellectuals engaged in the materialist critique on the other. Because all of the intellectuals that I've mentioned were either Marxist, revolutionary socialist, or anarchist, meaning they were all anti-capitalist, and they were just part of this broad, left of liberal, obviously, anti-capitalist revolutionary critique. Whereas the French theorists, you could not say the same thing about them, and I'd be happy to go into details in this regard. So it's in this light then that we can see with greater clarity the social function of the historical commodity fetishism that structures much of the historiography on 68. It serves to simultaneously excise the work of anti-capitalist revolutionaries from French theory, while also retrieving the symbolic value of 68 as a marketing slogan to promote the purported radicality of those figures who had largely turned their back on revolutionary thought and practice. The end result, at least for the global theory industry, was that the left border of critique was shifted to the right, moving from revolutionary anti-capitalist positions to a purportedly radical discourse that is devoid of any systemic materialist critique of capitalism, and by extension, imperialism, the global racializing framework, the gender division of labor, and many other such things. Now, one of the reasons that this happened historically, and I'll again be very quick on this, is that the only way to understand some of the repackaging of French theory as being radical is as an intellectual reaction to 68. And so I think that there are just heuristically 4 different reactions that we can identify in intellectual circles to what happened in 68. And this makes sense as well of within French theory, different splits and different drives. So one form of reaction was that of radicalization. Definitely in the case of Rancière and Bourdieu, you move from kind of, in the case of Bourdieu, from a social democratic position to a Maoist position. In the case of Rancière, from a kind of structuralist Marxism, which has a lot of problems in relationship to revolutionary politics, to a kind of anarchism, or what he would later admit was an anarchism of sorts. Foucault and Deleuze went from, Foucault was a Gaullist anti-communist. So he started to flirt with Maoist politics for a little while, for about 3 or 4 years, and then pulled back and adopted very reactionary pro-imperialist positions on a number of fronts. And I'd be happy to go into that. Deleuze drifted to the left, but it was an he regularly made anti-Marxist statements, and so it was a kind of anarcho-communist, nebulous leftism that was also informed by strains of Maoism. But in any case, all of them shifted to the left. You see it in Deleuze's corpus really clearly, where he was doing the petty bourgeois intellectual work of writing books on individual philosophers to say, oh, we might think of them differently in the history of philosophy, to post-68, then doing this kind of explosion of work in difference and repetition, anti-Oedipus, and other such things. So it really marks and Foucault's corpus also. There's a very clear shift post-68. Reformism is another number one of the reactions. I won't go into this. Paul Ricoeur is probably the best example of it. He really tried to advocate for a form of liberal reformism that could recuperate the radical energies and drive them into a kind of liberal institutionalized position. And he was largely discredited for that in the activist and certain intellectual communities. Another position is that of radical recuperation. And I've mentioned this before, but I understand radical recuperation as the process by which intellectuals will posture and position themselves as radical in order to recuperate the symbolic power of the hard left, but to recuperate it for a project that is within the frameworks of the extant capitalist system, right? In that regard, they get the symbol of radicality without the substance. And this is one of the most widespread forms of radicality in the contemporary academy. I'll point to Roland Barthes in this regard. He drew on Derrida's distinction between writing and speech in order to make a very flat-footed argument that somehow 68 was all about speech, but it needs to be about writing, and writing is the only way to make a real revolution. You know, of course, Kristeva and Suxu and Clément and other people would pick up on this as if writing wasn't somehow embedded in material structures, an economy, and other such things. The fourth position as a reaction was that of complete and utter rejection. Aron, who was the intellectual kind of parental figure to Bourdieu, led the charge in this regard. And he brought together a lot of the other intellectuals who had worked with him for the CIA front organization and receiving a lot of funding from the American corporatocracy and the global corporatocracy in order to launch an assault on leftist politics and leftism more generally. And in fact, Aron, prior to the publication by Ferry and Renaud, was one of those responsible for suggesting this outlandish analogy between French theory and 68. But again, identifying it as if it was a bad thing. So the final consequences for this, and this is what I kind of like to tease out and then wrap up and open up, is that I think the stakes of the research that I'm doing become very clear if we undertake a simple counterfactual experiment. And that is that if you could imagine a world in which you're brought into higher education and you were trained, regardless of your field usually, that the most radical, cutting edge, important theory that you needed to read and understand in order to be taken seriously as an artist, as an intellectual, as a curator, in any way, shape, or form, was the revolutionary theory of figures like Sartre, Beauvoir, Christine Delphi, Lefebvre, Castoriadis, Guérin, Ben Said, etc. Right? A universe, consider a universe in which when you brought up structuralist and post-structuralist thinkers, the major reaction would be that these are elitist academics who, under the banner of a form of aristocratic radicalism, akin to Nietzsche's, right? Nietzsche embraced this term of aristocratic radicalism and was really a central figure for Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, and so many others. Was not only anti-capitalist, he was he wanted to turn back the clock to some serious, not just class warfare, but like naturalized class warfare, master race kind of shit. And so, of course, he was at the paragon of critique for many of these figures. So imagine if structuralism and post-structuralism was identified as this elitist project that haughtily rejected revolutionary politics and often defended the status quo if they didn't sink into a kind of reactionary conservatism. Right? In such a world, their so-called conceptual and discursive radicality would be recognized as a form of social capital for intellectual mandarins who enjoy swimming downstream while pretending, in accordance with their idealist habitus, where saying takes precedence over doing, right? Whatever you say is more important than what you actually do. And that it's sufficient to simply proclaim by repeated incantation that things are otherwise or radically different, without actually having to do anything. Now, that being said, it shouldn't be surprising at all that the leading theory in today's world, which is dominated by American-style imperial capitalism in an era of neoliberal assault on the globe, is a theory without revolutionary political significance, which leaves everything in its place while creating the discursive illusion of radical change. Right? It's perfectly logical that the international political economy of ideas would conform to the international political economy too cool, right? Just the political economy in and of itself. In that regard, I think that it raises much larger questions regarding the historical social function of French theory in this very specific sense of the term, because it led the historical charge against the dominant philosophy of the post-war intelligentsia, which was Marxism, right? And the replacement of Marxism by the discursive pyrotechnics of anti-revolutionary French theory, and the promotion of the latter as the most critical and avant-garde of all theories has been an enormous conceptual coup. It has served to police the left border of critique by discrediting revolutionary thinkers as passé, unsophisticated, beyond the pale, or consigning them to oblivion, while redefining the very nature of French theory or critical theory more generally in terms of the work of non-revolutionary thinkers, right? This shift, moreover, I should add, is part of a much broader project. And this is what I refer to as the Great Western Ideological Realignment, by which the intelligentsia and many other members of the managerial classes, right, journalists, cultural producers, artists, and other sorts, have been coaxed and prodded away from the anti-capitalist left and toward the non-communist left or other orientations that would be further to the right. So there's much more that I could say about this, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up there and just open up for questions, criticisms, concerns, or other such things. As in the past, I'll just take stack. So go ahead and put your hands up whenever you'd like to jump in. Zion, I see your physical hand, so why don't you get us started?
Yes, like when you talking about criticism about intellectual imperialism, that reminds me about like recently I read a research about a critique about I think it's Negri's book Empire. I think you have read that before, and like in the book, like Negri talking about like the empire is not like determining like a physical area of people or like any like culture. It's like kind of like they got a power to determine the human nature and humanity and what kind of human we are like supposed to be. And I think that is also like related to what you're talking about, intellectual imperialism. And like I think like the most, even though the most like radical like a thinker and like a theorist and also the Frankfurt like theories, like they also assume like they are not eternal, like they are not outside of this empire. If you want to unite all the working class and fight against the system, you have to enter, you have to like go inside of this empire first. So I think like what you're talking about, intellectual criticism, like if you wanted to or become a radical like a theorist, you wanted to unite it all the Marxism, you have to come to like high education system. You have to come to this kind of academic like this kind of system. And I think like even all the radical like theories like all the Frankfurt like Benjamin, and this is people like they assume they are no outside of this empire. And I think this like for example like coronavirus may be kind of like cut like entrance for this empire if like there are another system like outside of this empire can give other people a new chance to challenge this kind of system and challenge the theories.
Yeah, that's a great way to start out. I do think that, yeah, what I'm interested in at once diagnosing, but then also elucidating the causes behind is the intellectual empire that defines the coordinates of intellectual work within the global academy, and that has been an imperial project. Education has always been, at least within the Western world as it's structured under capitalism, an imperial project. I do think, though, that there is a difference between the ways in which certain theorists will describe the effects internally of particular power dynamics within the academy, right? Foucault has done this perhaps more than a lot of other people. And there's a difference between diagnosing and describing certain internal functionings and providing a materialist account of the forces that produce those institutions in the first place, identifying the driving forces behind what Foucault will call the microphysics of power. It's the second element. And thirdly, clearly identifying how we can collectively transform those institutions instead of simply bearing witness to them from within and taking it that this is the most radical position possible. And so within, I've kind of insisted on this when we've talked about other thinkers or other traditions, but I think it's always very important to identify the horizons of one's critical intervention. And so what I've just said about Foucault, I would equally say about Hart and Negri for a number of reasons. I don't want to get too far afield. They have very bad materialist historiography. There's a lot of problems that I have with their particular project, and as well with Domenico Lusordo has formulated an excellent critique of what he refers to as their left populism and their kind of dismissal of any actually existing socialism under the idea that, well, the multitude, or what others will call the plebeians, right? Foucault and Glucksmann and others will use this term, and others will call it the subaltern, or, it's the privileged subject of marginalization, exclusion, etc. That somehow this bearing witness to this figure and this marginalization is the political project. And that as soon as you actually build enough political power to address the system of oppression and exploitation that produces a subaltern, a plebeian, the multitude, and other such things, then you have to usher in immediately the critique of every actually existing socialist experiment. Now, it depends on the individual figures in this regard. Foucault was categorical in 1977. The entire tradition of socialism needs to be condemned. There's not a single glimmer of hope from anything that we've seen in Cuba, China, Vietnam, anywhere. So in that regard, I just want to foreground that as an important element to add. But there's a ton of other hands. So why don't we go on to, I think, Melissa, your hand's next.
Hi, thank you for that. That was a whole history that I knew nothing about, obviously for the good reasons that you outlined. So the question that I have to ask, I'm not sure if this actually even bears on your project, because I think that you're thinking a bit more about the history of how things got excluded. But one just thought that came into my mind as I was listening to your overview of this new project is the question of where do we situate things. Like an obvious example would be Derrida's Spectres of Marx, right? That are, belatedly, way after 68, but nonetheless arguing that Marxism is, or at least in 1993, arguing that Marxism after you know, the fall of the Soviet Union is more urgent than ever. So again, I don't know if that exactly goes along with what you're arguing, but it's just a question that occurred to me.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. There'd be a lot to say. Let me just put it rather succinctly, and that is that Derrida's discursive pyrotechnics have not invisibilized his material investment in a certain politics, right? It doesn't matter what you say when you occupy particular social positions and you contribute to particular rituals, your politics are apparent in your practice. And his practice has been one in which he has generally defended the Western liberal status quo, including the critiques of actually existing socialism, which he never seriously engaged with. And he had a very direct hand in rehabilitating and enshrining the work of fascists and Nazis, including, of course, Martin Heidegger, and perhaps even more famously in the case of the United States, Paul de Man. Paul de Man's involvement with Nazi publications and his very overt fascism is clear to anyone who wants to look into that record. Derrida, of course, not only shared a friendship with him, but de Man was integral to promoting Derrida's career at Yale and through the circles that arose around Yale, including Spivak, who of course was one of Paul de Man's students, who then translated Derrida and created this really tight-knit network. I believe Barbara Johnson was there as well, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, this theoretical agenda has a material history and materialist consequences that we need to identify as such. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is that, and Pierre Macheret has written very poignantly on this, and a few other of those coming out of the Althusserian tradition, that the idea that Marxism would be something to focus on as a discursive and intellectual endeavor at the precise historical moment in time at which actually existing socialism in Soviet sense had been dismantled and opened up to capitalist vultures is suspect, to say the least, right? There's a way in which the specters of Marx is precisely what Derrida was interested in, right? As soon as Marxism was quote unquote gone, which is not true, then we could resuscitate it as a specter for intellectual and discursive rumination and function as radical recuperators who are not interested in materialist analysis, but instead focused on the radical symbolic veneer affiliated with Marxism when it's no longer a materialist threat to one's social standing, one's political views, or other such things. So I guess you could say I take a broadly negative position on Derrida. And I probably should have said this prior. I don't do this lightly. Like, I studied with Derrida. I was very into Derrida 20 years ago. And so have gone, it's been a long process. It's not a flippant, dogmatic Marxist rejection by any stretch of the imagination. Esteban, I think you're up next.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the talk. Very, very interesting. And well, I have a question about the way in which thinkers express their thoughts, so to say. So we could criticize the radicality of thinkers, yeah, considering what they say in their works or in interviews, but also as you show, focusing on the on the places they have in different institutions or how they live and so on. But I'm also interested. Maybe you can say something more about it. I'm also interested in, well, the way of writing or of saying things, of communicating their thoughts, because I think it may be very radical in regarding the theory he or she develops, but well, if that thought doesn't get to the oppressed because I don't know, they don't have the background, the material background to really understand or get in dialogue with that thought. Well, it doesn't get to be so radical. I think. So maybe if you could say something more about
Yeah, definitely. I would say two things quickly. One is that the audience of your writings becomes transparent based on your particular writing style. And if you have a referential basis that requires years and years of petty intellectual study in order to be able to master and understand, then it's clear that the people that you're speaking to are the elite trained intellectuals. And there are reasons for that that have to do with a lot of other social forces. Because one of the things that's integral to a particular style that has been developed in France is the idea that there's a discursive complexity that is so profound that you can't even begin to marshal a critique unless you have navigated all the sinuous webs that they've strung together and all of the webs that lead back to Heidegger and Hegel and Plato and other such people, right? So it's also a defense. It's not only that it's pitching to the elite crowd, it's a defense strategy against any straightforward critique of this discursive practice. And the last thing that I'd say is one of my beloved writers whose lapidary prose I couldn't more strongly recommend. In fact, we had one of his readings for the first session, is Michael Parenti. And one of the things that Parenti often said is that it's not because you have a convoluted or so-called complex writing style that your ideas are actually complex. In fact, it is often, if not always, the opposite. Because a lot of these writing strategies are discursive tropes and moves that you can learn like a ballet dancer. And once you know them, you endlessly redeploy them, right? It doesn't require in-depth analysis. It doesn't require a complex materialist framework that you're always changing in relationship to new input. And when you think about how the global theory industry works, and particularly the publication rate of the global theory industry, it's fascinating in this regard, right? Someone like Derrida could write 3 books a year because he wasn't really doing any materialist research. What he was doing is he had his rhetorical and discursive set of dance moves, and then he would plug any new input into that. And it's a machine that would take any input and make some fancy output out of it. Right? Zizek does this all the time. It's like, how many fucking dialectical inversions can you introduce in order to confuse people to the point of not fully understanding what's going on? So I think that that's also bound up with a particular writing style. So anyway, I've probably gone on too long. There'd be a lot to add to this. But Alex, I think you were up next.
Hi. This kind of goes back to I emailed you a while ago about this kind of question. So I mean, this seems to get into some of these questions that talk to how the intelligentsia is moderated on a certain trajectory. And I mean, for most of us in this workshop, or at least a lot of us anyway, we're in that graduate school kind of bracket going on there. And the question I have kind of relates to how do you maintain that kind of radicality in your thinking when the trajectory so encourages you to fall into oh God, what's the word that you used? Into that veneer of radicality, right? Especially when you have things like dissertation committees, when you could have like 1 or 2 advisors that could be really like in favor of that radical mindset, but you could have a couple that could really bring it down. Or 2 is asking for a lot, I know.
No, I mean, it's a great question. I do think it's really like the starting point should be recognizing what the historical social function and the current power dynamic of the Imperial University is, and not have any illusions whatsoever about that. And also identify that one of the primary ways in which this works, because there's all of these really ham-fisted critiques of so-called totalitarianism, which is an ideological concept peddled by the national security state for years, that consist in saying, oh, there's these really repressive societies where there's one thought and conformism and all of this. But you see it very clearly within the American Academy, and I think the logic for it is that of uplift. Right? Everybody knows that uplift is this sense of, well, there's a stream that, or like an airstream that is going to raise you up if you can just catch it, you know, and you catch that uplift and woo, all of a sudden you're at Harvard. That form of uplift is one of the most pernicious types of censorship, right? Because what it's doing is it's communicating to everyone, if you want to pass your dissertation committee, you want to get a job, you've got to do this. And we all know it. And we all, I mean, anybody who's thought about it for 2 seconds knows it, but we tend to snicker about it, you know, on the sidelines, so to speak. But the question that you raise really goes to the heart of what it means to be situated in a dynamic where that uplift is functioning, you know how it operates, but at the same time, you don't want to just give over to it entirely. And this is the conundrum of living under the contradictions of a capitalist system and a system of knowledge production that favors this type of uplift. So I don't think that there's a simple blueprint to this. I guess I would say 2 things. One is that it's unbelievably important that you have intellectual communities that function outside of the academy. Otherwise, your horizons of engagement are taken by other people who are worried that they're not going to pass their dissertation committee. Activist communities in particular are communities that are based on the communal constitution of knowledge production over years. They're not beholden to the imperatives of the university, and what they want is real material change. And I think that that is, and in fact, if you look at 20th century America, I think there's a very easy argument to be made that the most important intellectuals in 20th century America operated outside of the academy. And if they were in the academy, they got chased out, or they were marginalized, or they were considered to be freaks of sorts. And the other thing that I would say is that it is true, if you decide that you want to be within the academy or navigate the academy, that you have to find tactics and strategies of dealing with that recognize that the kind of absolute purism of saying, okay, it has to be, you know, absolutely this way or nothing at all, will lead to a series of roadblocks and will complicate one's life in various ways. And so finding ways of negotiating that it's like smart organizing. Really dumb organizing comes out and says, today we're making the communist revolution, we're just going to all sit here and it's going to be the communist revolution. Good organizing realizes that the communist revolution is Z, we're at A, let's begin building this. And so at an individual level, I think it's really smart to think of, how can I do what I really want to do, plug it into a system that would empower me, but use that power to leverage it in certain ways so that I can begin to move that system in the directions that I think are the most important. In my own case, I can say that that's definitely what I've tried to do. I have tried as much as possible to use whatever institutional power I have, which is minimal, and that's the reason that I founded the Critical Theory Workshop, is to move things in a way where there's an institutional structure that empowers people and allows them to actually have a real conversation about the material forces that are impacting their lives. Again, a lot more to say about this. If anybody wants to come back, like if Alex or anybody else wants to come back and say, wait, I disagree with you, or you forgot about this, just chime right back in. Otherwise, I'm going to keep an eye on Stack. Sibeli, I think you're up next.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So I would like to think a little bit over this methodological pessimism that you describe in the work, for instance, of Etienne Balibar. And I agree with the way, for instance, how he describes Black Lives Matter. And this is just to bring like a more concrete example that it's closer to it for me. But as a movement of insurrection and uprising against the establishment and a call for some sort of radical change in both like material and moral aspects of society, also like in the form of rejection of the subjugation of Blacks. But I was a little disillusioned with his reading of the movement. In a recent lecture, for instance, he told—
This is Balibar that you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah.
So in a recent lecture, Balibar talked about, there was a question about the possibilities and the potential, for instance, of Black Lives Matter to bring some radical change to, you know, patterns of social and racialized relations in the US. And then this is kind of what he answered. I'm going to quickly quote this verbal conversation. So, questions of recognition of discrimination are not in fact affecting the hardcore of the capitalist system. And if you concentrate on that, if you put your entire force in the development of identity politics, I don't agree theoretically. I don't believe that the system can simply change through these ideas. So basically, yeah, this is what he says. He doesn't believe that the Black Lives Matter as a discourse is just one section of the proletariat, and the system is not going to co-opt that. I don't think I agree with his answers based on some historic examples that comes to mind, but I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on this matter, and I'd like to hear if you agree or disagree and why, and if you don't agree, what are the ways of effecting changing? Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. I have not read that piece by Balibar, but I'm familiar with his work, of course, and his general position on contemporary politics. It depends, so I can't speak to the specificity of that argument, but what I can say is that there are different ways in which the current uprisings have mobilized particular forces. And one of them is that Black Lives Matter, of course, emerged as a hashtag in order to describe a really insurgent and radical politics a few years ago, but then was co-opted and made into a network of non-governmental organizations that received, what was it, $100,000 at least from the Ford Foundation, if not more, and from other major corporate and governmental interests. So there's an element to what's referred to as Black Lives Matter that has to be specifically, I think, identified and understood, and that is the attempt at liberal corporate management of radical Black politics within the United States, right? I don't know if Balibar, I would actually be a little bit surprised if he was going in that particular direction, but that needs to be related to some of the driving forces behind the current uprisings and revolts have been those who are connecting the dots between racial politics and the history of racial politics in the United States and the materialist practice of global exploitation that has produced the systems of racialization that subjects are subjected to. Meaning those who, and there's a million examples of this that one could point to, the Field Sisters come to mind, Boots Riley comes to mind, Eugene Perrier comes to mind, and many others, who have identified that the severing of identity politics of a specific sort, right? An identity politics that is culturalist and presupposes that the central focal point of politics should be the recognition of the minority status of particular cultural identities and the symbolic celebration of them. That's not necessarily linked to a material change in their actual socioeconomic standing that would make them no longer marginalized, right? And so this deeper materialist politics doesn't, and I don't think can be understood in terms of, oh, it's just a reductivist class first analysis that rejects all understandings of race and racialization. On the contrary, what I think the best version of this politics is doing is recognizing that the systems of racialization that have been produced in the United States in order to justify, in many ways, post facto, as the Field Sisters have demonstrated, institutionalized slavery, is a system of racialization that needs to be contested as one of the primary ways in which capitalism manages and maintains a super exploitable population, the racialized population. So in other words, the struggle for Black liberation is also the struggle for Latinx liberation, is also the struggle for liberation of indigenous folk, for the liberation of women, and that all of that is a materialist struggle that recognizes that there's a social system in which all of these are components. And that the hand-waving of an identity politics that simply rolls out corporate mottos that, of course, the corporate ruling class has embraced. You know, who can't wear a Black Lives Matter or kneel with some Africans or whatnot? We've seen this, it's laughable. And so there's a difference between a materialist politics and a kind of corporate liberal identity politics that I think is a central dividing line. I haven't seen Balibar develop a really explicit critique of identity politics in that regard, so I can't vouch for whether or not he's going in that direction. And I've disagreed with him on a number of other positions that he's taken on contemporary politics. So I don't know if, Sibeli, if that responds, or if you want to react to that in various ways.
Thank you. I think that this was more than I was expecting. Thank you.
Eli, I believe you're up next.
Yeah, Hi, Gabriel. Thanks very much. I guess my question actually sort of builds a bit more on the yellow vest piece that you sort of sent us for material today, but maybe I could adapt it to be a bit, a bit more general. I guess I'm sort of wondering, so I think a big part of, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, of the way that you sort of frame your intervention into the history of French theory, which by the way is incredibly compelling, is sort of about this, in a sense, kind of classic problem of the embeddedness of the intellectual, right? In either, I mean, and one could think of this in two different ways, right? Either embedded in movements and therefore sort of organically emerging from the strategic, sort of tensions to that movement and thereby, right, transforming oneself through, practices, as it were, or, embedded in the sense of being ideologically mediated, of being embedded in the dominant, ideological discourse and so on. And I think this is an important question. I guess I'm wondering if there, in your opinion, are instances wherein one's refraining, I don't want to use the word abstaining because that's generally abstinence. I've never thought it was a good strategy, but one sort of maybe lack of sort of active participation in movements like this is necessarily an indication of a sort of more general pessimism, or whether there might be instances where it's sort of more a question of the critical interrogation of the content of those movements. If I may offer an example that in a sense sort of breaks with already the sort of division of the intellectual and the practical, I think a really, really good example of why a question about what sort of our metric is for how to be involved and when and at what point and in what capacity, I think is indicated actually by Che's early activity in the Congo, right? In 1965, Che is sent to Congo to support the Simbas, offer a whole host of guerrilla strategy, which of course he has a wealth of, and so that ought to have been very helpful. But not long after that, the Stanleyville massacre / the Simba rebellion / Operation, Rogue Dragon are all enacted, right? And so it's actually, a terrible bloody mess. And after that, the Cuban state, internationalism is very significantly revised to establish a kind of vetting process for various decolonization movements. And the reason being is because it was very clear to them that the initial impulse to simply be embedded in whichever movement happened to be the case was simply not going to be sufficient, as was evident with the breakdown of sort of the leadership and with the Simbas. So I guess I'm sort of asking maybe from a more, a slightly less, strictly intellectual sort of position, but also sort of in a general practical revolutionary capacity, sort of what that metric ought to be then, sensitive, by the way, entirely to the fact that what you're describing is a dominant trend in the Western Academy, which is to say that we're autonomous from concrete politics. So I agree completely with that. It's more sort of a follow-up question, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Obviously, within the US Academy and the ways in which it's been globalized, there is an instrumentalized intellectual position that is part of a very specific politics. And so what we're supposed to do is watch liberal media at best, and then vote for a candidate that the ruling class has chosen for us to repress us for the next 4 years. And that's what our politics is. And so I do think that, as I mentioned in the piece, the starting point for any analysis of the intellectual and their politics should be that we're always already instrumentalized. And the question is then what you do with that. All of that just to say that we are embedded, right? If those who are working within the institutions of higher education, that needs to be the starting point. And in relationship to that, if one simply maintains one's embedded status and then chalks that up to neutrality, it's complicated, we'll wait and see, the presumption is that you are somehow a neutral onlooker and that you're not participating in a particular politics. Passivity, onlooker status, these are all politics, right? There's a great line by Walter Rodney who says that if intellectuals aren't explicitly Marxist, or at least in the socialist camp, then we know they are solidly ensconced within the bourgeois camp. I think that's true, because materially, that's where their practice is anchored. And so in relationship to that, when there are major movements, one of the easiest examples actually, because I don't know how many people know the yellow vests and what happened there, but a very easy example, now that we have the historical depth to see all of this, is what happened with Occupy. right? Occupy was this enormous movement, and there was a lot going on. People were pushing and pulling in different directions. But one of the things that a lot of the global intellectuals did is try to cultivate the veneer of radicality and then give, you know, their, 6-minute statement on YouTube that would then cycle about. And so another figure I think that is important to identify is the figure of the kind of spectacular politics, right? It's only when streets are on fire that you're going to run out and get a quick photo op in order to ratchet up your symbolic status. That's very different than intellectuals who I would refer to as interventionists, who are always keen on trying to embed themselves in radical movements that are trying to push the envelope, not in order to just train those movements, but to learn from them in an organic process that is dynamic and that is ongoing, and also to try to liberate themselves as much as possible from the dominant ideologies of the university. So I don't know if that, again, there's not a recipe for this stuff, and I don't think anyone would imagine that there would be, but the wait and see attitude is a politics that is unbelievably dangerous. And the other thing that I would say is that one of the reasons a lot of intellectuals don't get involved in political organizing is that they know full well, and this is true, that 5 years later, things are much clearer than they are at the moment. But at the moment is when the struggle of forces still is pliable enough that you can shove it in particular directions. And so various intellectuals who would go to Occupy and say, oh, well, this is what Occupy is, I'm not going again, didn't recognize that, well, no, there is an enormous social movement, and the role of revolutionary intellectuals should be to try to connect the dots between an enormous social movement and the type of organizational patterns that we need in order to build real power over time and transform society. So you're never going to find the perfect moment. And this is like echoing back to the Adorno conversation that we had. You're never going to find the perfect moment. As George Jackson said, writing from the belly of the beast in prison, he said, if there's not a revolutionary situation, the task of all revolutionaries is to create it. Right? You're not going to find the perfect situation. You have to build power over time. So anyway, I've probably gone on too long, but it's a really important question. And again, feel free to chime back in or push back or criticize me or just bring up a joke or something else to make it a little less serious. Otherwise, we'll go on to Scott.
Well, I'm in a room that is really echoey, so I don't know if it sounds weird. Sorry, I just moved. I have 3 things I'm sort of interested in hearing about, and you could just like sort of choose. One thing that I think kind of connects the reading that you gave us about the yellow vests and then what you just said is something that Kristen Ross says about May 68 is like the thing that happened was like experienced on the streets, right? So like all the intellectuals who wrote about it, she calls this sort of police function of history in her book on 68, that like there's nothing to see here, nothing happened, it was a failure, it didn't seize state power or whatever, doesn't like take into account what the people who were actually on the streets experienced, which was a new way of living, right? In that moment, it may not have persisted for decades, or we're not living it now, but it was something. And I think the same thing goes for Yellow Vests and Occupy and all these different things, right? Like that is a revolutionary moment that changes the possibilities. So that was one way I was thinking about like how May 68 is often misunderstood, and maybe the Yellow Vest is misunderstood, especially from academics who are writing from outside the experience, that they don't apprehend the new relationships that are formed in struggle. And so I guess one question I have then, okay, so from the May 68 perspective, one thing that I've seen, like, working on Ockinghem in particular, is that one of the things that the people who were brought up through the various Marxist formations was disappointment, because the party formations were hierarchical, authoritarian, right? And that goes through the official Communist Party to the different Maoist formations. And I think like Ockinghem is an example of someone who kept going more towards a libertarian anarchist and by way of like a spontaneous, spontex way. So like there's a disappointment with a certain form of Marxism that I think veers towards an anarchism. And I'd sort of be interested in your thoughts on that, because I think often May 68 and other radical movements try to get co-opted by Marxists who have a revolutionary blueprint, and they then misapprehend what's going on in the streets. And then as far as it goes for French theory, this is a separate question. I wonder to what extent do you think that the depoliticization of it happened through its finding a home in literature departments?
there's a lot there, maybe starting at the end and working back up. If you know that there's a great piece by the sociologist Michel Lamont called How to Become a Famous French Philosopher, the Case of Jacques Derrida. And it's a witty little funny piece, so it's definitely worth reading. And she traces out in particular the ways in which French theorists and Derrida more precisely was brought up within comparative literature departments, and that's where the fame, renown, visibility, etc. It has to do with a deeper history of the American institution and the way in which, and you saw this in the post-war period, the Red Purge of the US university really focused on philosophy departments because Marxism was considered to be a philosophy, and they wanted to make sure they got all of those people out. And if there were any even supposed radicals, then they could be put into literature, arts programs, and other such things in order basically to communicate to the world that, well, you know, these more radical discourses are fine as long as they're understood as artistic, meaning, you know, they're creative, they're not actually scientific, they're not a real threat. These are just some kids messing around with, you know, discourse or whatever. So there'd be a lot more to say about that, but that's very quick. The second point on the disappointment with Marxism is really true, and it would take a long time to unpack some of the things that were going on in '68, because from the point of view of the national security state in the United States, '68 was actually an opportunity in France to drive a wedge between the Marxist and the emergent anarchist elements and the anti-communist left elements. And so in the international scene, it was quite a complicated site of struggle, so much so that the student leaders of the '68 movement were approached by the CIA in the wake of '68 and offered substantial amounts of money in order to, they wanted to co-opt them and make them into, and might very well have in certain cases through the course of their trajectories. But another element that is important in that regard is a lot of the leaders said that, particularly I'm thinking of the Trotskyists, said that the fundamental thing that we lacked was a revolutionary party that could harness the energy of a social movement, including students and workers, and give us the focus and the organizational power necessary to actually accomplish our ends. And so many of them went about in the late '60s, early '70s trying to build that party or those parties. So I think that there are ways of, usually the critique of the French Communist Party, and I have a million of them and could share a million more, then bleeds into, well, it's the party structure itself that is corrupt. We have to get rid of all parties. We have to go to this kind of libertarian, left, horizontal lifestyle politics. The consequences for that, I think, are also that lifestyle horizontalist politics are the easiest to destroy, the easiest to make sure that they never get some real state power and other such things, and they're not generally recognized as a threat. And so, again, we'd have to unpack all of this, but I think that that's an important part of that moment. And maybe the last thing that I would say is that, going to your first point, that if you take '68, Occupy, Yellow Vests, and other such movements, I think that you're absolutely right that there's a lot. Any revolutionary conjuncture brings in a lot of different elements. And that one of the things that is important is to be able to identify the short, medium, and long-term horizons of political organizing. And that is some of what some activists did in '68, right? They recognized that, well, '68, it was the biggest worker strike in, what was it, 9 million? Some estimates go up as high as 12 million. It was unbelievable mobilization. The entire country was shut down in a way that never has been since the '30s prior or since. Were there ways of building on that energy and having a medium-term and long-term project of actually dismantling the Gaullist state? And they attempted to do that. Many of them attempted to do that. And I think that's good organizing as well, because one of the limitations of thinking that, well, you're just going to have, it's kind of social movement politics versus party politics. One of the illusions regarding some social movement politics is that you're just going to have this groundswell, everybody's going to spontaneously realize that the system's corrupt and we're going to get rid of it. Problem with that is that the corporate class already has in mind, including all the corporate NGOs that they run and other such things. And if you don't have a real power structure that is ready to take that power, to occupy that power vacuum, then you have what can often happen in the case of social movements, and '68 is a good example of this. One of the most understudied aspects of '68 is the unbelievable anti-leftist repression in its wake. Late '60s and early '70s is like Patriot Act style demolition of leftist organizing in France. And it's one of the main reasons that a lot of these French theorists also begin to drift towards the right, because the left becomes locked up, incarcerated, targeted, bombed, and other such things. Again, very rich questions. So if you want to push back or jump in with other things, don't hesitate. Otherwise, Asan, I think you're up next. I'm going to try to be a little quicker because I see that there's a lot of hands. So I'm going to try to respond more.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I find it really interesting. It actually relates to some research I'm doing at the moment. I mean, I've read books like French Theory and the American Politics of French Theory, and I've been reading this specifically to prepare a paper that I'm writing on like Foucault and the Iranian Revolution, which was popular for a while. And you had like Foucault in Iran, which is a text that came out that tried to rehabilitate the kind of wars that have been happening for the last 2 years of Foucault being a secret neoliberal, etc. And people have been debating it back and forth. I guess the thing is like you're bringing up Foucault as a de Gaulleist, and you're showing these like these conservative strains in these post-68 thinkers that have now taken the energies of 68. And, you know, I had an interesting conversation with the author of like Foucault in Iran, and he has a reading of rehabilitating Foucault in a particular way of like having a radical assumption that there was disagreements with Althusser, and then they had a falling apart, but ultimately there's a kind of trajectory that there's still a critical and radical possibility in Foucault's reading. And I think, you know, as someone which comes in between like critical theory and intellectual history, what would be your reading then with these kind of like acrobatics that happen over and over again through different turns of these readings of these kinds of thinkers?
Yeah. Well, one of the other pieces that I'm currently working on, the title probably speaks for itself, is Foucault, the Faux Radical, because I actually think that he plays a really important role in consolidating a certain leftish intelligentsia around the idea that you can do particular forms of critique and yet be a rabid anti-communist and reject all socialist projects. And so I do think, you know, there are certain cases of very smart, very solid materialist leftist intellectuals who have been inspired by Foucault, work in a certain historical vein. I would certainly characterize myself, at least the early work that I did is definitely very influenced by Foucault and a certain heritage. So again, I'm not saying any of this lightly, but I think that if you go through and piece the parts together of his political trajectory and his alignment, the pattern is absolutely transparent. And that is, he was an opportunist careerist who knew which way the wind was blowing. Prior to 68, Castoriadis says it explicitly, prior to 68, Foucault never hid his reactionary positions. And he had very reactionary positions, right? He didn't support the anti-colonial endeavor in Algeria. He actually supported the Gaullist regime that set up the state terror forms that would then be exported to Latin America. Right? These are the people he's lining up on. He got on board with 68 in the wake of 68 to ride the symbolic wave of radicality, but as an anti-Marxist who drifted close to certain Maoists, and then by the mid-1970s came out as a rabid anti-communist whose closest political ally was André Glucksmann. Glucksmann was an anti-Marxist hack who was identified by the CIA as one of the most important assets that they had working in France at that one point in time. And of course, they identified Foucault as a major asset due to his anti-Marxism and the fact that he never seriously criticized American imperialism. The last thing that I'd say maybe in that regard is Foucault tried to save face to a certain extent. Right? He came out in 1977 and proclaimed that all socialist experiments anywhere in the world were horrific. And then he tried to recoup this kind of radical veneer by focusing on Iran. He knew nothing about Iran. I mean, his writings on Iran don't even mention the CIA orchestrated coup d'etat that is the background for the entire modern history of Iran. So it's deplorable at a historical level. And then the reason he's interested in Iran is primarily because he identifies in Iran a spiritualist politics that was in the past of Europe that's being reborn in the East. So it's a very simplistic Orientalism combined with a rabid anti-Marxism, because he sees in the Iranian organizing, he cuts out any Marxism that was there, and it was there, some of it was there at least, and identifies that it's great because it's a upsurge that is not based on class struggle or the idea of a revolutionary vanguard. So what he's interested in Iran is an anti-Marxist revolution. right? So the anti-Marxism is just constant throughout the majority of his corpus, with a few exceptions in the early 1970s when he had conversations with Maoists and began using a little bit of Maoist language. So, but Hassan, your research sounds great, and I will definitely send you this piece I'm working on. I'd love to get your feedback on it because it's a bit, it kind of goes after a sacred cow, and so I'd love to get other eyes on it. Yeah. Jamie, I think you're next.
Yeah, so my question is specifically aimed at like violence, and the violence that, and like the ideology around violence. And so, you know, I know you wrote an article and you talked about it in your Yellow Vest article, like the spectacle of violence and how this is used to sort of cover up the like broader structural violence of the state. And I feel like, you know, a lot of these, this has been played out again in the US with the sort of like George Floyd protest and like the brutal suppression of protesters by the police. But then there's also this sort of the spectacle of violence of like, especially in like the first days of the protest, when there is like, you know, people burn down like a McDonald's and, you know, there's just like this bourgeois horror at the spectacle of violence. But in a way, it like this focus upon these acts of violence in itself becomes like this like detour away from the actual like materialist aspects of the protests themselves. And it becomes something that people then have to like argue for or against, and you have these like tortured debates of like, well, I agree kind of what they're doing, but like they shouldn't be, you know, burning cars in the street. Like one, like you were saying earlier, imposing like some subjective totality on the protesters themselves, as if there's like a group leading all of this across the nation and people are like actively deciding to do something violent, you know, even if if you consider like violence against like just physical things without hurting people, true violence. And in a way, I see this as sort of, you know, I think like a good person on this is like this historian R.O. Meyer in The Furies, and talks about like legitimate and illegitimate violence. And in a way, I see violence as acting as like this constant like ideological tool used by the state for its own benefit, for when it uses violence as just, you know, as you say, like the rule of law, and anything that is outside of those boundaries is then used to critique and even to get like leftist radical people against it, because like you can't condone the use of violence in this way. And I'm just wondering, you know, part of this, I know, like, yeah, in the US, there's no like revolutionary vanguard or anything leading some sort of movement. But how do you think intellectuals should handle things like this? Is this something to ignore? It kind of seems like a trap people are pulled into if you're asked, like, if you support like a violence in this situation. You're like, aha, you're awful. And then, you know, this kind of gets to like Lacerda's point of like, there's like communist ideology and like reactionary sort of like equate it then with violence in this really like tortured, convoluted way to always associate it with violence, while scrubbing anything that capitalism has done, any violence away from that system, and violence in that instance is just like power play or something. Sorry, that was kind of long.
No, it's a great, there's a lot to say about the issue of violence, and I've worked on it quite a bit. Three quick things. One is that, of course, what is referred to as violent by the bourgeois press is the violence, the subjective violence of resistance to an objectively violent system, right? So that violence isn't used to describe the fact that we live in a capitalist world where a child dies every 5 seconds due to, causes that could be avoided, malnutrition, no access to healthcare, and other such things. That's an unbelievably violent system, right? And I don't see any activists on the ground in the uprising today who are killing a child every 5 seconds. Right, so the scale and the level is absolutely incomparable. And there's a great book by Mark Neocleous that I was just reading called War Power, Police Power, that describes how the police and the military, because it's the same organization, don't get confused by the liberal distinctions, they do the same shit to us here that they're doing to people internationally, that is a form of constant class warfare. Right? So it's not that a war is going to happen or there's going to be a violent outburst. This is constant warfare. The second thing that I would say is that if violence doesn't work as a tactic, why is it that the ruling class has always used it so systematically and so successfully? It makes me think of, there's a great quote by James Baldwin who says, nonviolence comes up, nonviolence is invoked only in the question of Negroes, only in the question of Black people, right? Obviously, we're all aware of these kind of rote ideological reflexes, but what that's doing is saying that anybody who resists has to be nonviolent, but the system's violence can continue to be perpetuated. The last thing that I'd say is that I do think from an organizing perspective, which is slightly different, is that you can recognize the righteous anger of people whose lives have been destroyed, whose family members who have died, whose entire livelihoods have been taken away from them, and that they might act out in particular ways. But from a Marxist point of view, there's a long-standing tradition of identifying what's referred to as ultra-leftism. And ultra-leftism takes many different forms, but one of them is a kind of aggressive, spontaneous acting out to destroy a system that oppresses and exploits you. But ultra-leftism, from an organizing perspective, can often be an enormous hindrance to getting you to the goals that you want to accomplish. And if you go out to a protest and a bunch of your members light cop cars on fire and get arrested, then you've lost a lot of your organizing power, right? And so one thing that Marxists historically have been very good on is understanding how to work through the lies of the liberal legal apparatus in order to build power over time, and not succumb to ultra-leftism and the ways in which it can actually play into the hands of those who oppress you, right? While recognizing that at the end of the day, the ruling class is not going to let itself be voted out of power, right? Seen many examples, it will not happen. So at some point, then push will come to shove, of course. Maybe we can just, is it okay if we lump a couple questions together? I'm going to try to, the questions are too good, so I just want to go on at length, but the melodious sound of my own voice should not make me ignore being a timekeeper. So why don't we have Svetlana start out, and we'll take 3 questions, and then I'll try to group them together. Svetlana, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Gabriel, for this talk that made me second guess many people I quote in my writing. I'm just wondering, if you address in your research Guy Debord and situationists, and what's their position specifically with regards to this passage from thought to action? Thank you.
Yeah, Leah, I believe you're up next. We'll just take 3 questions maybe.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say that whole intervention really hit home for me. I got some more thinking to do. Thank you very much. Here's my question. How do you imagine the possibilities of emergence for real radicalism among people like me, and probably for people like many of us here who are already marginalized or exiled in a certain way from the academy, which would also be our sustenance deriving employer, let's say, in the system that is, you know, as we need to navigate the concerns of being able to live under a roof next month. If I put myself in the middle of the question, I end up kind of throwing up my hands and resigning in defeat. You know, I have a lot of physical problems, and I'm often sick. And so it's hard for me to, you know, go out on the street and do something. So on one hand, this means that there's a lot of kind of vital risk involved in precarity, economic precarity, and putting myself, my body on the front lines. But then on the other hand, I think that kind of living on the precipice of death all the time makes it kind of all the more unacceptable to compromise myself in order to win a place in this corrupt apparatus that is. So basically, that's my way of situating this question by way of personal example. But how to act then is, I guess, is the question in a world that conditions our continued existence basically on compliance with this regime that is.
Yeah, great question. Jackson, maybe we'll hear from you too.
Sure, thank you. That gave me a lot to think about. I was just wondering, in relation to sort of the material politics of 68 on the one hand, and then the theory on the other, where you situate aesthetic intervention and artistic production, because for me, there are certain artists and filmmakers that I think about when I think about 68, and whether or not you'd see them as being involved more on one side or the other. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. I'll try to be quick. Regarding Debord and the Situationists, they were both involved, particularly with the occupation at the Sorbonne. And then there was an occupation of another one of the educational buildings. I think it was the Institut Pédagogique in Paris. Many people identify their work, particularly in the mid-1960s, kind of leading up to the movement. And so I would put them in the camp of like socialism or barbarism or these other kind of revolutionary socialist oriented but not orthodox Marxist groups that were trying to build power on the hard left and contribute in various ways. Regarding Leah's question, obviously it's a much bigger question insofar as it touches probably all of our own subjective existence. I would say that subjectively, just to develop a little bit of what I had already responded to in an earlier question, finding tactics and strategies by which you can navigate these institutions and basically satisfy the problem of how do you remain true to a political orientation while at the same time satisfying the institutions that you operate within. There are a lot of, I mean, and it would be a long discussion, but you can write things under antonyms, you can, or pseudonyms, you can get involved in jobs that are outside of the academy so you don't have to be beholden to the particular peer review process and other such things that go into the academy. And so there are a lot of kind of nuts and bolts types of things that could be done. But regarding organizing too, sometimes it's assumed that organizing is really just boots on the ground in the street. And this is a very important part of organizing, but there's a lot more that goes into developing organizations and building power. There's the communications teams, there's the education teams, there is the kind of immediate outreach teams in one's community and other such things. And so there's a lot of need for people who would have different skills and different abilities. And so I think that that's always important to take into account. The last thing that I would say, and this relates to the critical theory workshop, I do think that ultimately there are ways in which the corporate neoliberal university, and we see it going like straight into an even bigger crisis than it was already in, is not necessarily a place where one could really build serious power on the left. And I'm a believer, as the critical theory workshop probably demonstrates at a practical level, in counter-institutions and the power of counter-institutions for leveraging resources and power itself away from some of the dominant institutions, but then also using them as bracing points, right? So the critical theory workshop is not just some, straightforward activist platform. It is trying to imagine what a university would be like if the lingua franca was materialist analysis, including materialist feminism, including radical Black and Indigenous politics and Latinx politics, including revolutionary anarchism, revolutionary socialism, Marxism of various different sorts, like that. All of that should be part of a broader materialist mode of engagement. And that if we don't do that collectively, like if I just did that individually in my own writings, I would, probably definitely feel superior to other people around me in a very trite and narcissistic way, but I wouldn't be contributing to a broader collective project. And so I do think that there's unity in numbers, or there's power in numbers, and that doing that type of collective organizing around education is absolutely essential. Like I've done a lot of things with the Marxist Education Project in New York, which would be another alternative platform. There are many, many others. Regarding Jackson's question, yeah, I think that aesthetic production and the kind of cultural revolution is really important. I deal with this in the longer piece. There was, of course, the group of writers. Barthes wasn't involved with them, but Duras and many others took a strong left position. Blanchot was another one of them, very supportive of the movement, very involved, and contributed many slogans, posters, and other such things. And I would say more generally, because I've done a ton of work on aesthetics, that one of the things that I'm interested in is how politics, of course, is about very material factors and changing that material, particularly the socioeconomic world and the racial and gender and sexual dynamics of that world. But it's also about composing a collective cultural universe that allows us to change the coordinates of our existence. And that aspect is quintessentially important. And for all of those who have, operated in activist spaces or participated in street performances or spoken word poetry, or there's a million examples of this, music concerts, other such things, in which there's a real ethos of collectively producing a counter-hegemonic community. These are empowering and vital, vital resources for the hard left, because if you assume that you're just going to argue your way into power, you're sorely mistaken. Like our ideological composition is, and this is part of the argument that I made with Jennifer Ponce de Leon, our ideological composition is not at all reducible to a set of ideas, right? It is the discourses that we use, the way we speak, the way we perceive the world, right? Our temporal and spatial horizons, like where we think we are, what we think is possible in the future, all of this is culturally constructed out of the aesthetic matrix that we're part of. And so I'm a very, very strong believer in the power of cultural revolution, while recognizing that you can't sever it from materialist politics, right? There's lots of people who want to spin off and say, okay, we'll just make a film and this will make the revolution. No, no, no. This has to be embedded within a larger set of movements that are actually changing the material structures of human existence. Again, if anybody wants to come back at me with criticisms or follow-ups, by all means. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep chugging along, and maybe we can hear Thomas, Constanza, and Trong. So Thomas?
Yeah, thanks. So I have two things. One is more of a thing and the other is a question. So first, you already spoken to this quite a bit, I think, but sometime last week, the University of California strikes have been doing these public lectures through Zoom. And Fred Moten raised the problem in his discussion about, how did he phrase it? He asked, does Black Studies need an exit plan? And that's not my question to sit with, but I think we could sort of appropriate it and ask, does critical theory need an exit plan, or do critical theorists need an exit plan from the university in order to be like truly critical, truly radical, things like that? And then my second thing, I just want to hear more a little bit about, you mentioned this sort of, this heuristic that's existentialism versus structuralism versus post-structuralism, et cetera, and how that's used to sort of move away from Sartre and others. And I'm just wondering if you can speak a little more on that, because I've been reading a lot of phenomenology, particularly as it relates to Herbert Marcuse's early work and Tran Duc Thao, who you mentioned. Yeah, so thanks.
Great, thanks. Constanza, do you want to weigh in?
Yes. Hi, everybody, and hi, Gabriel. Well, I really appreciate the debate on the role of the intellectual in general and on the importance of seeing that theory is itself political and that there is class struggle and political struggle in theory, meaning that one can adopt a position that contributes to the building of collective body of power, or one cannot do it in a certain context. And I was thinking about what you mentioned, Gabriel, on Lacan's position on May 68, and we can still hear this sort of interpretations of radical social movements. For instance, I was thinking last year during the Chilean uprisings, Jorge Alemán, who is a famous Argentinian psychoanalyst and a critical theorist, was very much concerned about the aspirations of the movement, implying that the mobilization of the Chileans was looking for a master, and he was seeing like a problem there. And well, considering the way in which the US Academy and the French theory, as you have presented it, expands, I totally agree on the importance of building intellectual communities outside the academy, but I also feel that we need like another step there. And within that context, which we could call a critical position on the role that academy has in the reproduction of capitalism, I would ask, what can radical Black, feminist, indigenous, ecological, anti-imperialist political movements teach us? How can they also transform the way in which we, in counter institutions, produce knowledge and organize ourselves?
Great question. Tron?
Yeah, thank you. And my question is kind of related to what Constanza just talked about, so it'll be good. So in the context of, you know, the combo of production, distribution, and reception of knowledge and cultural production, I think you've touched a lot on production and distribution when it comes to the 68 thinkers or the fake ones. Then I would like to know in your project, or if you could speak more about your account of the reception of such strategies to sort of uplift these thinkers to where they are now. And I'm asking this question is that because even when we do a sort of a counter history of what happened with 68 and its thinkers, the strategy itself seemed to me that is also situated within very specific contexts that led to what happened. What I meant by that is I'm imagining, like, for example, in the context of the Vietnamese society, for example, I'm saying like a qualifying pre-95 before, you know, the US and Vietnam, and we become much more globalized, neoliberal, whatever. Like, I was thinking, like, if we just sort of do a thought experiment of bring it to the context in Vietnam, we tend to naturally suspect people who are famous, right? So, like, if Foucault want to be where he is now, he had to like move to the mountain and like never take any material things, and he had to actually practice whatever it is that he sort of has a veneer for, right? So then it brings up the questions of revolutionary practices or ideas have to sort of adapt to whatever specific context of that society or culturally that was embedded in that society to make it work or make it doesn't work. So then it opened up a lot to interventions. It's almost like reimagining for this particular society what would work and what would not work. I hope it makes some sense.
Yeah, those are all really great questions. I think I will close down the stack. If anybody is like really hot to add something, then jump in as I'm talking. I would say that I think this is the first Q&A I've ever done on this topic or related topics where there was not a hostile question. So if someone wants to correct that and go after me on various fronts, then by all means do, because the sacred cow phenomenon around these figures often makes it such that people just don't want to hear what I have to say and ignore the material history in the name of defending father figures and other such things. So in order, Thomas's questions about the exit, critical theory's kind of exit plan, I mean, it is true that the way in which critical theory has been codified within the Western Academy is such that it's been lobbed off from the more trenchant forms of critique, and that the uplift that exists in the Academy is for those who will provide for minor critiques that remain internal. So it's a kind of cottage industry at this point for the third and fourth generation of critical theory to criticize Habermas for having left out X, Y, or Z that usually have to do with things like gender, race, colonialism, or other such things, but then not have that go to the point of a larger critique of the Habermasian project, or for that matter, go back to Adorno and Horkheimer. And so there is a way in which that very tradition has been institutionally consolidated around a rejection of more revolutionary positions, hence requiring something like, I don't know if it's an exit strategy so much as a connection to, and this might relate to the two of the other questions, a connection to truly radical traditions of critique. And those have generally functioned and been coordinated within activist communities outside of the dominant academies. In the US context, the Black radical tradition from Du Bois to George Jackson and beyond comes to mind, but also the kind of radical Latinx traditions, and all of these, I say tradition, these are people pushing and pulling in a lot of different directions. So I'm just using this as pragmatic shorthand. Certain radical feminist traditions, etc., have really developed bodies of knowledge, and this is what Constanza was encouraging us to plug into, that we both, I think, need to plug into, need to learn from, and also need to recognize as one of the central motors and most important motors for the generation of ideas, right? So part of the book project of which this, from which this comes, is looking at what happened to, because this relates to the question, some of the questions as well, the Black radical tradition in the United States and the more trenchant Marxist-Leninist elements were all targeted for elimination, incarceration, and other such things. And that has led to a situation where Black studies in the United States tends to have a political center of gravity that is incomparable to the political center of gravity of George Jackson, Huey Newton, and so many other people, or Du Bois, or so many other people within that tradition. And in that regard, recognizing where these radical traditions are operative and plugging into them, I think, is a very, very big part of the equation. Because one of the things that ideology does is it functions as a form of perception management. And it says to everybody, if you're interested in ideas and smart people and understanding how the world works, look over here at the university. Don't look over here at these dirty little organizing groups that are trying to change the world because they're just, dumb and vulgar and reductionist. And so changing that perception management has to be a very, very big part of the project and is definitely part of my own intellectual practice. Thomas, on the question of existentialism, structuralism, and post-structuralism, this is the kind of standard movement model that's been used to import French theory, and it has a lot of pernicious consequences, right? It makes someone like Simone de Beauvoir, Tran Duc Tao, and Sartre, and Fanon for that matter. Fanon's relationship to Marxism is very complicated, but he's a radical anti-imperialist. And it makes them into existentialists who are phenomenologically, introspecting in order to either intuit essences or describe their experience in certain ways. But all of them were either Marxists or Marxian in various ways. And so making them into existentialists or phenomenological existentialists is carving out their politics entirely. Simone de Beauvoir and the kind of evacuation of her politics is one of the best examples of this, right? Because then she's made into a kind of almost liberal feminist existentialist figure, and her own agency as a thinker, her own revolutionary politics are cut out in a very classic kind of liberal misogynistic approach, which is, well, she's a woman, we need to have a woman on our syllabus, we'll just bring her in and make her into, a liberal, basically. And then the structuralism and post-structuralism does need to be understood. The structuralists were all very, very anti-Marxist, and they were upfront about it. They repeated it almost ad nauseum. And post-structuralism was just an intensification of that project. And so the idea that you could describe these movements in terms of their own internal descriptions and not situate them in the larger historical and material context, I think is a major, major problem. Constanza, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've kind of responded to that question a little bit, but knowledge production, and you see this as well. One of the other things that I would add is that the publication industry, the conference industry is all structured around this, right? So that when people are interested in Marxism, they'll go and look at Verso books as opposed to Pathfinder Press, or City Lights books, or these small publishing houses that have always worked hand in glove with activist communities because they'll want the Marxism, but with the kind of, trendy theoretical stuff going on. And there's been a lot of poignant writing on how the university, the publication industry, the conference industry functions as a form of global social triage. And what it does is it separates out the wheat of fancy theory from the chaff of all of those forms of theory that would actually lead to concrete communal changes. So we have to not only identify that as a form of perception management, but then also marshal power in order to struggle against that. Tran, your question about adaptation to a situation, I think it's a complex question, in part because if adaptation means accepting the general protocols of a world, like the world that we live in is the most unequal world in the history of planet Earth, hands down, according to so many different ways of analyzing this, but just socioeconomic inequality alone, hands down, as well as the number of people who die every year, millions and millions of people. And we have an ecological crisis that is leading to the end of innumerable species, and it is very likely that the Homo sapien, through capitalism, will eliminate its own conditions of the possibility of existence. So if adapting to that system is what one needs to do to get a job or to, you know, appear as a theorist, but be kind of radical or kind of critical, I think that that adaptation is at much too high of a cost. I think that, oh yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Sorry, I think I misspoke, or
okay. Or maybe I misrepresented.
I think what I was getting at is that not only looking at sort of the production and distribution of these thinkers or ideas, you know, post 68 and how it looks like, but also why did the, let's say, the ruling class using these very specific strategies to make them up there, right? Because in a way, the mass have power too, in a sense that within that system, the mass can be in a way manipulated, in particular by making them the experts, right? Getting them to conferences and so on. Whereas in a very different society, doing that would be the opposite, would have the opposite effect. That's why I brought out the examples of Vietnam, which led me to the point of my adaptation. I meant revolutionary adaptation in a sense that, given this is a society we're living in, that, you know, we are probably will not continue to exist anymore. And how do we build a counter whatever practice or counter a hegemonic, right, practices that isn't, maybe it goes back to what you talked about earlier too, that is a you're constantly learning from it and try to make something out of it, because what worked in America would probably not work in Chile, right? Or other places. And what Marx wrote about, I don't know, 100 years ago, the spirit of it is there, but can we actually do that? Because the line of the working class now is so different, and so on. I hope that clarified.
Yeah, I mean, and this might be a good place to kind of wrap up, because this research that I'm sharing with you is in part of this larger book project that's entitled The Intellectual World War. And the main interest is that there's been a ton of work done, very excellent work done, on the global war to impose capitalism in every corner of the earth. And this was driven largely by the national security state of the United States as the kind of global police state. And so I've done a lot of research on that, and it's very important for understanding the world that we're in. But there's been a lot less work done on the ways in which not just the national security state, which is a whole series of agencies, but also the global corporatocracy and the ruling class in general has identified from the get-go that the most important war was not the war on people's lives. The most important war is the war for hearts and minds. And that if you can control people's minds, then you have reduced your costs enormously. And so the overall framework of this research is looking at how the ruling class, the corporatocracy, the national security states, the foundation networks, the Imperial University, and all of these other forces have waged an international war on the mind whose primary purpose is to kill the idea that human beings could, of their own volition, organize a world that would be more egalitarian. That's the most dangerous idea imaginable, because it's a threat to the extant inequalities that are inscribed within the capitalist system. And so for me, part of this work is understanding how that war functions. And there's actually a lot to be said about it, because people don't understand, most people don't understand how propaganda campaigns are run and how complex this intellectual war is. Yes, they killed certain intellectuals. Fanon died in the arms of the CIA. A lot of other people were killed in this war, but there are a lot of other ways in which, through foundation funding, through the setting up of certain institutes, through think tanks, through conference networks and other such things, there has been this, it's a clandestine war. that has been unbelievably successful. And it's the reason why, if you study certain fields, you don't study particular things. They've been cut out through the course of this intellectual war. And so the question of the counter-hegemonic force is how you begin to, not only begin to, because the power is already there. There's already a lot of intellectual counter-hegemonic forces that are out there, but you need to be able to coordinate between them, understand the strategies of destabilization, and then build power over time. And this is absolutely situational, as Trong was saying, but I think it also needs to be resolutely internationalist, meaning that you can recognize the specificity of Vietnam or the United States today or other such settings, while also inscribing them within an international system of global capitalism that is subjecting people differentially around the world to many of the same basic forces. And that maybe we can close on this. I don't know if people are familiar with the Sut Jolly, who is a media analyst and has done some very important work. One of the things, and he's closer to certain liberal positions that I'm not seduced by, but one of his claims, and I think it really goes to the heart of this, is he says that, you know, it's unbelievable the world we live in, because as I was mentioning, you know, social economic inequality globally is worse than it ever has been. The planet Earth is on the verge of being destroyed and uninhabitable for human beings. There are all of these problems. In Michael Parenti's language, reality is radical, right? And it just got a lot more radical because of the coronavirus pandemic and the way in which it has been weaponized as a warfare on the global poor, and so many other aspects to this. And so the ruling class has an unbelievable task at hand. They have to take a real material situation that lends itself to global radicalization of the most extreme sort, and they have to transform that into some type of sitcom narrative that can be run on Netflix about why people should just stay at home and not get involved in politics and nothing can be changed. This propaganda campaign that they have to run requires unbelievable energy, resources, money, and they're constantly hiring people to do this. And so what Sajali points out is, he says that the biggest problem that the ruling class has on its hands is that if it is not every second of every day pumping out the most sophisticated forms of propaganda and ramming it down our throats, anytime there's a tiny crack in that system, people are going to see through. And the more people who see through, the more we're going to be able to build that counter-hegemonic power that's necessary ultimately to dismantle those who are producing these myth machines that they're trying to suck everybody else in with. But thank you so much for the excellent questions, for your patience, as well as your interest in this type of research. Sometimes it rubs people the wrong way, but I think it's an important part of processing and understanding the traditions that we've inherited as objective structures so that we can move in other directions.